So welcome everybody to the African Doctoral Academy Masterclass webinar. My name is Natalie Kavalik. I'm the Program Manager at the African Doctoral Academy, and I am joined by my colleague Luther Chippembera and our guest speaker, Professor Nareshni Govender, who will be speaking on the topic of whose knowledge, whose voice, academic writing in the era of Gen AI. Professor Nareshni Govender is an Associate Professor and Writing Center Practitioner at the Durban University of Technology with qualifications in social sciences and humanities sector. She has a PhD in Management Sciences from DUT, specializing in marketing with a focus on media, gender, and identity construction. She holds a postgraduate diploma in higher education for academic developers, cum laude from Rhodes University. She is also involved in several research projects focusing on student development in higher education. Prof. Govender is well published and has presented at many national and international conferences with a focus on teaching and learning in South African higher education environment. We'll be opening the floor to questions after the presentation. Please feel free to ask your questions in the chat or Q&A section, or you can raise your hand and my colleague Luther will be assisting. Just a reminder to everybody that's joining the session, it is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel. So welcome, and I now hand over the platform to Professor Nareshni Govender. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much to the African Doctoral Academy for having me. It's really wonderful to be here and to see so many join. I see more and more people coming in, so that's really fantastic. I think this is such an important topic to be talking about, and I think the more we talk about it, the better we're going to understand it and implement it and use it in the different spaces we are in. So I'm just going to put my presentation in slideshow mode, hoping that you can see it. So the title of my presentation today is Whose Knowledge, Whose Voice? Academic Writing in the Era of Generative AI. And indeed, today I am going to be talking about generative AI and how it is transforming higher education and bringing new opportunities. And as we know, a lot of challenges. And more importantly, our responses to it in higher education and what it actually means to navigate our way ethically through this new landscape that we find ourselves in as researchers, as writers, as students, and as academics. So today's session is about or is designed for anyone that is writing or engaged in academic writing. So postgrad students, researchers, and academics across Africa. And I want to discuss the evolving relationship between research and academic writing and generative AI or Gen AI as we know it. So a disclaimer, I am not an expert in AI in terms of the technical side of it, but I am here today to share my ideas and my views on AI in terms of the space that I work in, which is, working with students in relation to their research projects and writing. And my talk is grounded in the South African and broader African higher education context. And as I share these views, I want us to think about our own research, our academic writing, and concepts such as academic voice, originality, knowledge production, integrity, and ethical authorship. So the aim today is to offer some sort of practical guidance on how AI can support rather than replace rigorous scholarly thinking and writing. and equip you with perspectives and practical strategies so that you can use Gen AI as a tool to strengthen scholarly thinking, argumentation, and your writing, while at the same time safeguarding the integrity and authenticity of your academic work, specifically your academic writing in terms of your current research projects. And today I want us to step back a little bit, and I want to emphasize or talk about universities and the purpose of universities. What is higher education for? And who does it serve? Right? I want us to just take a second and to think about that, and to think about what is my role at university as a student or researcher. And perhaps in the chat, you could respond to any of these three questions. Particularly, what I'd like to know is, what is the role, or what is your role at university as a student or researcher? You're welcome to just put in some ideas in the chat. What is higher education for? And who does it serve? I think it's really important for us to reflect on these. Are there any comments or ideas coming through in the chat, Luther?
I think just a moment. They must be busy typing.
Okay,
Please feel free
sure.
to share them in the chat. Okay, they're starting to roll in. I
Okay.
see one that says, my role is to create nuanced knowledge. Then we also have another one, teaching, research, and community development.
Absolutely, yes.
Another one, knowledge creation and dissemination.
Mhm.
Higher education serves empire at the moment, but should support social development. That's another one.
Beautiful.
Okay, another one, my role is to provide research-based solutions towards better society, contribution to new knowledge and impact in society. Higher education is for uplifting our citizen and expanding our knowledge generation. Higher education is to help build the manpower and address challenges. Okay, we're getting more and more.
Wonderful. Thank you, Luther.
Okay, sure.
Thanks for that. And I think it's really important for us to reflect on those concepts of university and the purpose of university and why we are here. And I believe, particularly in this era of AI and Gen AI, we need to understand what is the problem before we can jump to some sort of solution for it, right? So we need to clearly define what the problem is. And I feel that we often forget what we are here for, what we are doing, what is our role in society. And universities are really important social structures, and they serve a particular purpose in society. And we, as writers, as researchers and academics, we have a role in contributing to that purpose, right? And I think, however, what happens is that we sometimes get so caught up in our day-to-day activities, and we perhaps don't spend enough time thinking about and reflecting on what is my role here at university as a student or researcher. And if we don't understand that clearly, we become more vulnerable to changes in society, whether it's social or technological developments such as AI and other developing trends or issues or problems. And what happens is we may use knee-jerk responses or very reactionary responses in terms of how we respond to them. So when I talk about AI today, I'm talking about the large language models, like our Copilot, Claude, ChatGPT, and research-specific LLMs, because these are really shaking up the way we are working with information and of our understanding of what is knowledge. And Gen AI has huge, huge implications for knowledge and what counts as knowledge and how knowledge is produced. Also, in terms of how society grapples with it. Universities are significant sites of knowledge making and dissemination. And those were some of the comments that some of you made and shared. So we need to be thinking about these knowledge questions and ask ourselves, what do these large language models mean for knowledge creation and dissemination in higher education, right? That is really important. That being said, many of our universities are focusing on AI policies, plagiarism, AI detection. I'm sure many of you here today have been involved in these conversations. Perhaps some of academics that are here have been involved in working on policies. I know at my institution, I've been on a task team working on this. And, as much as they are important, I think that we need to look at the idea of AI in terms of our work in higher education a little bit more deeply. And the more I engage with AI, I think I also do become a little bit uncomfortable, because in as much as I, for one, am using it every single day, I think that we need to really understand how it works to be able to make judgments and use it responsibly and ethically. So what I'm saying is that there are affordances and there are limitations. And we need to be aware of the fact that, yes, there are aspects of it that are problematic, but at the same time, we need to be cognizant of the amazing advances that I'm sure we all have read about, the phenomenal scientific breakthroughs that have been occurring as a result of, broader AI now in terms of drug discovery, pattern recognition, early diagnosis, and in fields like, engineering, climate change, agriculture. AI has been used to model systems and really to predict outcomes and support problem solving at a scale and a speed that, would not have really been possible before. So there are the affordances, but there are also limitations, especially when it comes to us working on academic writing in terms of judgment, context, ethics, and meaning. So AI can process information, right? But it cannot understand it in human sense. So the challenge is for us to recognize both its usefulness and the boundaries, right? We, however, in higher education, we kind of navigating through this concept of AI in a little bit of a different way. If I look at us as students and researchers and academics, we almost need what I would call a guiding or an overarching frame to be able to grapple with and question and navigate our way through AI. So how do we do this, right? It's about going back to this question of what is the purpose of higher education? Or what do you think higher education is for? Right? Should you just take a second to think about that? A lot of you earlier shared about what you think your role is in terms of higher education. A lot of you shared about contributing to society, creating, disseminating new knowledge, right? And I want you to take a moment and think about your own discipline. How is it shaping the way in which you see the world? Okay. So that's the question I want to pose, and you can add your response in the chat. So I want you to think about your own discipline and share, how do you think it is shaping the way you see the world? Okay, you're welcome to write in the chat. Right, whether you're in the field of engineering or agriculture or social sciences or arts, how is it shaping the way you see the world? Any comments, Luther?
Okay, so far we have one in higher education equals creation of new knowledge to solve current problems and minimize future ones.
Mm-hmm.
We're just waiting for more to come in.
Sure.
And then just to add, whilst we're waiting for some to come in, it can be a way to cultivate informed citizenship. Yeah, I see they're rolling in. Education is liberation. Another one, I start to doubt my interactions. Is it real or is it my AI talking to your AI? Another one, create or shape a better world. Developing and honing critical thinking skills. Higher education is social institution serving for the well-being of society and societal impact. Transforming minds. My research is about generations at work. My research adds to this knowledge base and also provides evidence about the real impact of generation at work. How to teach people to think critically. Then we've got another one agreeing, critical thinking, problem solving, and support development. Higher education equals personal growth in a specific field, aiming to foster critical thinking and economic prosperity. Another one, in lawmaking, it can strengthen our outputs or compromise them.
Absolutely.
It's a space for learning and teaching to advance not only new knowledge, but the innovative approaches on implementation of that knowledge. And yeah, I see this still rolling in, but yeah, those are among some of the responses to your question.
Okay, thank you, participants and Luther, for sharing that. So, as we know it, higher education incorporates many things like community engagement, research, teaching, learning. But for the purpose of today, I want to focus specifically on teaching, learning, and research, because academic writing is aligned to these three concepts very clearly. I wanted to share a definition of higher education. And this comes from Paul Ashwin's book, Transforming University Education, a Manifesto. And he offers a really powerful, beautiful definition of higher education. He explains higher education transforms how students see the world and their place in it. what he is implying is that higher education is higher. It transforms you as a student, right? And I want you to think about what you are currently studying. I know we have writers and researchers here from such a range of disciplines, from engineering to law to the sciences to social sciences, right? And I want you, to think about the various modules that you are engaging in, the requirements expected of you, and how through those engagements, activities, readings, dialogues, the interaction, how those enable you to develop different sets of lenses. So you could be studying towards a social science degree, and here you will learn about issues of power, culture, society, right? And transforming the way you look at the world. If you're studying engineering, you may be learning how to, design solutions to complex problems, think systematically, consider the social impact of things like technology and infrastructure. In the health sciences, you may be engaging with questions of care and ethics, and human well-being. In humanities, you may be exploring language, history, philosophy, meaning, which deepen your understanding of the human experience and values. And if you are involved in commerce or business, for example, you'll be thinking about and engaging on issues around leadership, decision-making, economy, issues, and, responsibilities of an organization in society. But fundamentally, higher education changes the way you understand the world you are in, right? As well as who you are and your responsibilities to this world. And through that, what do we develop? There's this important aspect of what we term powerful knowledge, right? Knowledge that empowers and enables new ways of thinking, of being, and doing. So, and this definition, as beautifully unpacked by Paul Ashwin, it's very aligned to our South African 1997 white paper that talks about how higher education should enable critical consciousness and actually be empowering and enable students and academics to be able to participate in democratic life. So higher education is not the same as having more education, but it is higher. It gives you the tools and the means to ask questions, to be critical, to be skeptical, to think out of the box, to ask questions of power and whose interests are being served, and to critique information and ideas. And very much aligned to this is research and academic writing in higher education. And I ask, what is the purpose of research? Think about the research you are doing, right? You are engaging in problems and you are developing conceptual lenses. And this ability to be able to critique, to question, to build arguments, and not just accept things at face value is developed over a period of time. And whenever you confront actually anything in life, whether you receive a message now on WhatsApp that sounds suspiciously sensational or polished, you will be able to ask, where did this come from? Is it reliable? Is it real? When you come across a social media post, or a video, an image that seems convincing, you may just pause and say, actually, hang on, could this be AI generated or manipulated in some way? Or when you read a news report or a policy document or even a research article, you begin to ask what evidence is being used, what assumptions are being made here by this author or authors, and what may be missing from their arguments and critiques. So criticality is not only an academic skill, it is a way of thinking that helps you navigate even through daily life and make informed judgments and also engage responsibly with information that's surrounding us today. And in terms of research, we've got to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of research? Why are we researching what we're researching? Research, it should contribute to our collective understanding of the world, of our society, of ecology, of our humanity. When we engage in research, it's basically helping us understand things better. And these were some of the views that you shared this afternoon, right? It helps us to really engage with problems deeply. It helps us to be curious, to ask questions. And it really allows us to build conceptual lenses. It allows us to be curious and ask the what if, the how come, the what now questions, right? And, these types of reflections, they are really valuable and they are imperative for us, and they are at the heart of why higher education is a public good and why we invest in it, right? And that all of that is seen to be very fundamental to democracy. And these are the ideals explicated in our National Higher Education Plan of 1997 and the white paper that teaching and learning and research really needs to help us as students and researchers and academics understand that we really need to have a sense of responsibility. We need to be empowered to enter the job market, get meaningful jobs, be able to contribute, as many of you said earlier, contribute to society, participate in the knowledge economy, and to make a difference in society. So we really need to hold on to these imperatives, particularly when there are new developments such as Gen AI, so that we are able to navigate our way through it ethically in our work as writers, as researchers, as students, and as academics. So higher education is not only about, giving you this certificate at the end, this qualification, and producing employable graduates. It is about producing thoughtful citizens, ethical researchers, and critical thinkers who can contribute to democratic life and engage meaningfully in society. It should help us to learn to question power, interpret evidence, engage with complexity, and how to make informed judgments, right? And in this sense, universities are not just simply credentialing institutions, right? They are sites of knowledge, and sites where knowledge is produced, it's challenged, it's debated, and it's reimagined in ways that shape society itself. And participants, this really matters, especially in times like this, when we start, to reduce higher education to things like outputs, to marks, to completion rates, or even efficiency, we really lose sight of that deeper purpose of higher education. And this is exactly where the risks of Gen AI become more pronounced. So Gen AI must be understood through the broader purpose of the university rather than only through efficiency and compliance, right? So that being said, I am quite fearful that we are in this neoliberal environment where we don't have enough conversations about these things anymore. The purpose of higher education, reflecting on why we are here and why we're engaging in research. In fact, these types of conversations, they are not featuring, in our classrooms, in our um, department research committees, faculty boards, our senates, and a lot of focus is rather on the tick boxing exercises, the meeting of KPIs, and that is quite problematic. And in this neoliberal environment, when AI is introduced, a lot of universities are kind of taking this stance, either saying that, yes, it's really great, or it's absolutely dreadful. Great, because our students are going to hand in fantastic, beautiful assignments. And in terms of research, we're going to increase our outputs, and academics are going to be publishing much more, and there's going to be opportunities for promotion and producing journals at a rapid rate. And then damaging or dreadful on the other hand, because of issues like plagiarism and students submitting whole assignments that have been taken from Gen AI, and integrity issues. This approach it's really reducing teaching, learning, and research to technical things. And when AI is now here in this neoliberal environment, it's problematic because we are not considering what is it we exist for and what it actually means for knowledge creation. Okay? Instead, many of our institutions are focusing on plagiarism detection. I know our lecturers are all talking about they wanting AI-proof assignments. This is not even possible, right? Or disclosure statements. And these are they are poor knee-jerk reactionary responses to generative AI, and they are not going to be very sustainable, right? So, this evidently in many of our institutions, there's this strong focus on measurement, outputs, productivity, performance indicators, compliance. And it becomes very easy to treat Gen AI as a technical problem, something to detect, something to regulate or control. But when we do that, we are missing the bigger picture, right? We stop asking what learning is, what knowledge is, what writing is for. And instead, we're asking questions like, how do we manage this? How do we maintain standards? And yes, those are important questions, but they are not enough. Because if we only respond to it at that level, we risk reinforcing a system where our students and researchers and academics are working towards matrix rather than meaning, or towards outputs rather than deep understanding. So then we ask ourselves, what is the issue that we need to address? The issue is that the misuse of AI prevents the very transformation that higher education aims to create and produce. I want that to just sit there for a second, and I want you to think about that, right? So the misuse of Gen AI prevents the very transformation that higher education aims to create and produce. So how does it do this, right? How is it preventing this transformation? There are two things that I want to unpack today. The first is what we call cognitive offloading. Okay, so cognitive offloading is when we, as a writer, a researcher, an academic or a student, absolutely anyone who is learning, doesn't struggle with or grapple with or engage with meaning making, right? And the struggling with meaning making, the making it personal, the paraphrasing and building it into our context. This is the learning process. So when we as writers outsource all of this cognitive work of making sense of ideas, we are actually bypassing the process where knowledge becomes our own. And what does that mean? It simply means that knowledge doesn't become our own, and we are missing out on a valuable process, right? On the valuable process of learning. What we are doing is actually the opposite of learning. It's offloading, cognitive offloading, right? And this becomes a problem when a student asks Gen AI to summarize an article, generate a literature review, or draft an argument before you have actually done the valuable work of reading, thinking, comparing the different viewpoints of articles that you've read, and interpreting the information, right? And in that moment, the student may receive, you may receive very fluent text, but the intellectual labor that turns information into understanding has been bypassed, right? And the result of this is that the writing may sound polished, but it's going to lack depth. It's going to lack originality, ownership, and your disciplinary insight, right? The challenge is not simply whether the text is grammatical or well structured. The deeper question is whether you, as the student or writer or researcher, has actually developed the capacity to think with the material, right? Let me make this idea of cognitive offloading a little bit more concrete, right? Imagine you as a student, you have collated about 5 or 6 journal articles to read, and you're trying to understand a complex concept. And instead of working through the text, reading it, rereading, making notes, asking questions while you're reading, and struggling with the meaning of the different viewpoints of the authors, you ask Gen AI to summarize the article and generate a literature review, right? What may come back will look like a coherent, structured, and even a very sophisticated piece, but the question we need to ask is, where did the learning happen? Because the difficult work, right? Like I said, the comparing, the interpreting, the making sense of the ideas has been bypassed. So when we offload that thinking, we may gain efficiency, but we're losing depth, right? And over time, that has serious, serious implications for how we develop as writers, as thinkers, as researchers, as academics. This cognitive offloading, it really requires that we reflect on why are we here at university and how we can use the information from Gen AI responsibly. Okay? And this idea of meaning making was aptly captured in a recent article that I read in April by Dr. Kishore Paknikar, and he's a researcher from Pune in India, and he wrote an opinion piece on AI and education in a publication called The Perfect Voice. And he writes, he says, what has happened is that information has become abundant, right? Understanding has not, and thinking certainly not. We must first understand the difference between information and knowledge. Information is the data that we can access. Knowledge is when we understand that data. Wisdom is the ability to use that understanding in real situations. Artificial intelligence can organize information efficiently, but it cannot replace human judgment, doubt, and reflection. And this raises a deeper question. Is artificial intelligence truly intelligent, or is it an advanced form of accumulated information presented in a powerful way? It can process large amounts of data, recognize patterns, and generate responses that appear intelligent, but it does not understand meaning in the human sense. It has no curiosity, intent, or responsibility. And later in the article, he also asks a really important question. He asks, what is meaningful learning? And he says, reading carefully, thinking deeply, and expressing ideas in one's own words are essential habits. And then he says, the simple tools of learning, paper, pen, brain, and books remain as relevant as ever. And I think that is really powerful, and that is something that we really, really need to reflect on as writers and researchers and academics in higher education. So I said I wanted to talk about two concepts, right? The one was cognitive offloading, and the second is epistemic narrowing. So we need to remind ourselves, like I said, over and over again, what are we here for? We are here to engage with complex and powerful ideas. And we also need to be aware of what is it that AI flattens in this higher education space that we are in. So we cannot reduce ourselves to this dumbing down. We need to read and read and reread and ask critical questions, all of which contribute to us being able to write in a clear and coherent way. And, particularly with academic writing and writing for research, we need to have a personal connection with this new knowledge, right? Earlier I asked you about research and in your own discipline, what do you think the purpose of that is? A lot of you did speak about, having that connection, creating that new knowledge in your field, right? And, we can't forget about the importance of debates and discussions, the arguments we build, the judgments we make. Also, even the process of getting feedback from a reader and your supervisor and using that feedback to then strengthen what you have written in that original draft, and working on the aspects that you need to in order to submit another draft for review. All of that, right? And this reflection on your work or your writing and refining it, all of that is the learning, right? This learning experience must contribute to our growth. And that human connection is irreplaceable, right? And it is these critical lenses that are being developed that will allow you to actually go through life. So epistemic narrowing occurs when Gen AI reproduces the assumptions, the priorities, and patterns of the dominant knowledge systems on which it has been trained. And this really can marginalize local, indigenous, African, multilingual, and otherwise underrepresented perspectives. In higher education, that matters because whose knowledge is visible, whose language is treated as authoritative, and whose way of knowing are recognized, right? And all of this all shape what counts as scholarship. And in the African higher education context, this is something that we need to be very attentive to, because we've already been working to really challenge dominant knowledge systems, to foreground local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, multilingual scholarship. So the question then becomes, when we use Gen AI, whose knowledge is being reproduced, whose voice is being centered, whose is being marginalized? If we are not critically aware of this, we risk reinforcing the very inequalities that higher education is meant to challenge. And if we are not careful, Gen AI can intensify the already unequal visibility of knowledge from the global north, and while making African scholarship appear as secondary or peripheral or less standard. So still on the issue of the misuse of Gen AI, we know Gen AI tools are increasingly being used in writing, in research, in data generation, in our literature reviews. And this also introduces risks of unintentional plagiarism. So today I just want to also touch on the issue of how AI can lead to unintentional plagiarism. And I want to talk about recycling text without properly citing them. AI can produce summaries or paraphrased versions of text, and these may very closely mirror original content. And if not properly attributed, this can be considered plagiarism, right? We have to be mindful of this. Also, a lack of understanding of context. We cannot think AI is a thinking, intelligent entity. AI lacks human understanding and contextual awareness. So judgment remains irreducibly human, right? AI predicts text based on, pattern, not meaning. So we need to recognize AI as pattern-based systems trained on large data sets, okay? Also on this concept of unintentional plagiarism, We all have heard the words hallucinations and misinformation, where AI may generate false facts. And there's the risk of including fabricated or inaccurate information and references. So we cannot assume accuracy and accept just generic responses, right? We must scrutinize the text for information and accuracy. And, there have been so many cases of people and companies being sued because, eventually it's found out that the information provided is not factual. So these are things we really need to be mindful of because they can have really dreadful consequences. Also, in terms of bias in training data, which I touched on, AI reflects biases from its training data, can reinforce stereotypes and misinformation, and we need to understand, right, whose voices are being excluded, whose are being amplified. This is very, very important from a social justice perspective, right? And then we have the ethical and legal concerns, plagiarism risk if AI generated text is not cited properly, legal ambiguity around AI generated content ownership, and our institutions, we have varying policies on AI use, so we also need to be aware of those and understand them. So in terms of some best practices for avoiding plagiarism with AI, I want to talk about concepts such as transparency, accountability, and responsibility. But I want to also think about them in relation to what I discussed earlier about what higher education is for, the importance of critiquing, the importance of giving us engaging in those dialogues, the questioning of information, the really engaging with texts, right? All of those things which AI cannot do for us because that is part of the learning process. That being said, generative AI tools can be used to help us with brainstorming ideas, right? It can help you to understand concepts that are a little bit confusing, but you've got to use it cautiously and with integrity. It can generate information that's incorrect, so we have to use it, safely with that awareness of its consequences. Also, be honest and disclose how you used Gen AI in your research, depending on your supervisors or what research you're working on. Some universities may require disclosure statements at the beginning of an assignment, some at the end. If you're writing a journal article, the journal may request a disclosure statement after, your concluding statement. So offer those, right? Be transparent. Reference all the sources that you've used, even the AI ones. And if you need help with your referencing, all of our institutions have amazing library services. Go to your postgrad librarians who will assist you and advise you on these, right? But maintain this human oversight. AI can be used to enhance, but it does not replace human judgment, right? Review and edit AI-generated content to ensure that it reflects your original thinking, your ideas, and your research. That being said, I also want to share a recent social media post that I was looking through by a researcher. And I want you to just reflect on it for a second, because it's quite aligned to what I have been speaking about today in terms of understanding higher education, understanding why we're researching what we're researching, right? So this researcher addresses it to all those in higher education, and it says, Dear higher education students, using Gen AI to write your thesis or articles without appropriating, reworking, and repackaging information constitutes scholarly misconduct, right? They say it's going to come back and bite you, right? Affecting your credibility as an academic in the long run. I have a student who miraculously completed a proposal in record time, only to discover that the student's work lacked depth and insight, and that it was a string of nonsensical statements. Please do yourself a favor and read the articles that you cite, not just the abstract. Graduating students with poor academic insight will rot the academy even faster. Gen AI is an amazing tool when the information is properly curated, mediated, and critiqued. Gen AI gives you information, not knowledge. Knowledge you develop through the discomfort of learning and unlearning, and through critical engagement and experience. Universities and supervisors, you need to step up. You need to adapt. You need to get back to the drawing board. It's not business as usual. So very interesting and very, very true post. So I am finally at what I think is the central and most important part of my talk today. And this is about why critical reading matters, particularly in terms of for academic writing, right? And writing for research. Reading is very much aligned to our ability to write well, right? The more we read, the more we engage with various types of text, whether it's books, journal articles, reports in our field of research, the more we build our understanding and the more will be able to write in a way that is engaging, that shows we are able to build arguments, put forward our claims, show our authorial voice, right? And as researchers and writers, that is really important, right? We need to make sure that our voice is coming through, because at the end of when we submit an assignment or more so a research project, we are to be seen as the expert in that particular field, right? So our voice needs to come through, and the ability to do that and write well academically, the key to that is to engage in critical reading. And what I want to share with you today is a couple of things that I want you to use when you are working with academic texts, right? And these will help you not just in one assignment, but in all the writing tasks that you have, all the research projects that you may be working on now and in future, right? So why does critical reading matter? To be able to draw any meaningful conclusions of any research, you've got to read, and read from credible information sources, right, which are available from your university libraries. This will help you to engage with diverse viewpoints from various authors and researchers in your field, right? In higher education, critical reading means approaching a text as an active, questioning reader. right? As an active, questioning reader. I want you to sit with that for a second, right? What do we mean by that? As an active, questioning reader. A reader who is trying to understand not only what the author says, but also how the argument is built. What assumptions shape that argument? What evidence is this author or researcher using? What is left out? What broader intellectual or disciplinary positions does this text reflect? Right? So when we read our journal articles or other texts, relating to our research or our writing, it's really important to go into this text or engaging with it with particular questions in mind. And academic texts are not just sources of information. They are arguments shaped by particular perspectives, assumptions, and evidence. Now, you may be wondering, how do I become a more independent reader and thinker, right? How do we do that? It is about engaging with questions that will open up a text that you are working with rather than close it down. I can't tell you the amount of times, when I was a student and when I was working on research, I would have all of these journal articles, and you'd go through the first article, and by the end of it, sometimes you can't even remember, what you read at the beginning, because that's when you go into an article quite blindly without a plan. And that has happened. And I see students engaging in those same techniques, going through an article, reading it from beginning to end, but really not having a very productive experience of working with it in that way, right? So I want us to really ensure that we use strategies that are going to be beneficial and that we're going to use as a way to move forward and enhance and strengthen our academic writing, right? So these purposeful questions can help you as a reader move from summary to interpretation, from understanding to evaluation, and from agreement to a more nuanced response. So I want us to think about our approaches to the many journal articles that we collate and that we need to engage with in our research. And I really want us to be very intentional about when we are reading a journal article, right? With questions in mind before, during, and after reading, right? So the goal is not to just produce a correct interpretation. That's not the goal. It is about developing habits of critical engagement, identifying main claims, paraphrasing accurately, making notes as we are reading, being able to trace the author's argument, evaluating evidence that is coming through, noticing absences, right? And locating that text in relation to others that you have read, right? And wider disciplinary debates. So, as you read, remember that a strong critical reader is not only asking, what does this text say, right? But also, what is the text doing? And what does it make possible, right? And what does it exclude? Okay, so I really want you to think about that. And there are a couple of questions that are really powerful and are really valuable in terms of ensuring that when we are working with a journal article, we notate, we write down our ideas, and we have a basis from which to work and build those ideas into our drafts of our writing, right? And into the various different sections that we have in our research projects. Okay, so in terms of reading academic texts critically, I recently used this example in a tutor training session that I was doing, and I think it's really valuable because it gets a student or a writer or researcher to really work in a way that's going to be very beneficial in terms of being able to develop your written work. And I think in terms of, I want you to think about the journal articles that you are working with. Perhaps this afternoon, if your plan was to work through a couple of journal articles, use this technique, right? So the first aspect is about understanding the text and going in there with a few questions, right? And always having a notebook beside you or your laptop open so that you can notate, right? And capture these ideas. Because like I gave you the example of, when I used to read articles as a student and not make notes, by the time you are at the end of that journal article, you forget some of the concepts that you read earlier on, right? So, very important question. What are the main points of this text, right? Quickly notate. What are some of the main ideas that are coming through? Put them in your own words. It does not, at this stage, have to be perfectly sounding, in clear academic writing. Don't put that pressure on yourself. Just capture the ideas in terms of how you understand what you are reading in terms of the main points of the text, right? You can clean up the grammar, the punctuation, the spelling, and all of that at a later stage, okay? So also ask yourself, can I work out the steps of the argument being presented here by this researcher or author? And make a note of it, okay? And then when you're examining the text, look at the examples that are being used by these authors. Ask yourself, are they useful? Also ask yourself, can I think of others? And when you ask yourself these questions, make a note of it, put them in your own words, right? If you've come across an example that this researcher is presenting and you see a link between that and your current research, write it down and capture how you identify the link, right? Perhaps you don't. You can also make a note of that because you can build that into your argument, right? And then you can explain why you have an opposing view, right? Perhaps you want to explain the examples that have been presented by this writer or author, but you also think of others. Incorporate that and make a note of it, right? Because you can use that to build that particular section of your writing, right? Ask yourself what factors, ideas, people, or things have been included by this researcher, right? Or what has been left out. Perhaps there's something quite significant that you have seen even in other articles relating to this subsection or this field that you are researching, and that you feel that's a key thing that's been left out here. make a note of it, because you can build that in, and you can express that, express concerns of this article having left out this very important concept, and why you believe it's important, and why it should be considered, right? So that helps you build your arguments. And when it comes to academic writing and research, your lecturers and supervisors and examiners want to see that. They want to see your ability to critique information, to read information from other texts and build arguments logically. They want to see your ability to use evidence in your writing, okay? So the next aspect is in terms of evaluating the text. And here you ask yourself questions like, is a particular bias or framework apparent? Very, very key question, right? And can you actually tell what this author's school of thought is, right? Or that they belong to? And as you are reading through, do you feel like the author's explanations and steps followed through logically? Could a different conclusion be drawn? What are your views in terms of the main ideas, and have they been supported with reliable evidence? Okay, so make a note of these, because like I said, you're going to incorporate all of this as you build your own arguments, right? And another aspect is in terms of situating the text, right? Do you agree or disagree with what this author is saying, and why? And what connections do you see between what this author is saying here and what other texts are saying or implying, right? You could have come across an article in your discipline or in the area you are researching where an author unpacks a particular phenomenon or aspect of his research, and he highlights maybe 4 or 5 key areas or phenomenons to unpack that. And then you might find another researcher uses those very same 5 phenomenon, but adds 2 more really valuable aspects or phenomenons to discuss that particular research area, right? So you can use that to build your discussion. And it shows that you've read widely, you've engaged with various journal articles or books, and it will show your ability to critique information and build your own arguments and show your authorial voice in your research, okay? So also, like I said, it's really important to look at questions like, where does this article differ from other texts on the same subject, right? And what are the wider implications for you as a researcher and also for the discipline? So, these are really valuable questions and a valuable strategy or technique that you can use when you are engaging in reading your academic texts, because ultimately it is going to help you strengthen your academic writing, right? Because academic writing is about you being able to critique information and viewpoints, right? Being able to analyze information, analyze the viewpoints and opinions of various researchers and authors, and seminal researchers in your field, to critique information and then to kind of synthesize all of that, right? That makes for sound academic writing. And I also want to say that there is no shortcut when it comes to academic writing, right? We do know these AI tools are there. We spoke about how it can be used to help us strengthen our work, but we have to always be mindful that there is no replacement for human thinking, for us and how we engage with texts, for the questions we can ask, for being able to, use our context in our writing and align that to our research. So these are really, really important things that I want us to reflect on today. And I really hope that this exercise, this example, you found it valuable and that you will use it going forward in your research writing and when you're working with reading academic texts. So, this idea of critical reading is a practical skill that actually protects scholarly voice in the age of generative AI. Right? Critical reading is one of the most important safeguards in the age of Gen AI, right? It helps us to actually test whether the text is accurate, whether the claims are supported, whether the assumptions are visible, and whether it actually contributes to something meaningful to the discussion. And in a context where AI can produce fluent but misleading text, the ability to read critically, it becomes not only an academic skill, but it is also our academic responsibility. And we need to remember that we are here to engage with powerful and complex ideas to contribute to a growing body of knowledge, and we really need to take ownership in our learning, right? So before we move on to having a little bit of discussion and some questions, I just wanted to conclude with a couple of ideas and thoughts. And I want us to actually, return to the central question that has guided the session today. And that is, whose knowledge, whose voice in the era of generative AI? So, we know academic writing cannot be reduced to speed, efficiency, or having polished output alone. It must remain rooted in critical reading, thoughtful judgment, ethical authorship, and a clear sense of the purpose of higher education, and understanding higher education as a public good. Gen AI may assist us, but it cannot replace that intellectual struggle through which our ideas actually become understood, refined, debated, and made to be one's own. So as students, as researchers, as academics, our task is not simply to produce texts, but to produce meaningful, responsible, and socially significant knowledge, right? And if we hold fast to criticality, integrity, and intellectual humility, then AI can be used as a tool that supports scholarship without displacing the human voice at the heart of it. And that is the challenge before us. And it is also the opportunity, right? AI can assist writing, but only humans can do the thinking, the judging, the meaning making, and that our scholarship requires. And I thought I want us to end with 3 commitments today: to think critically, to write transparently, and to use AI responsibly, right? I want to end by asking you this question, or to complete this question. Luther, if you could perhaps include it in the chat for me. The question is, as a writer in the age of AI, I need to be more, and I want you to complete the sentence. So as a writer in the age of AI, I need to be more.
Okay, I've added that to the chat as well as the Q&A.
Okay, great. Just gonna stop sharing for a second. Go to the chat. So as a writer in the age of AI, I need to be more. Let me just update the chat. Critical, ethical, responsible, discerning, curious. Discerning about how I use AI. Be more obsessed with questions rather than the answers it can easily provide. Curious and responsible. Present, absolutely. More alert. More questioning. Yes, absolutely. You know, I think that we need to really, like I said earlier, understand that there are some really beneficial aspects of AI, but there are a lot of limitations, right? And it all goes back to us having this guiding frame of what is higher education? Why are we here? What are we doing as researchers? You know, what is our purpose? And when we understand that, I think we will then be able to use it ethically, responsibly, and in a way that will enhance our work as researchers. Committed, skeptical yet open-minded. Wonderful responses. Thank you, everyone. I didn't realize that I had taken this much of time. So I do apologize, but I hope we have some time for some feedback or some questions from you.
Thanks, Prof. Appreciate the excellent talk today from our side, from the African Doctoral Academy side, definitely. We can take one or two questions. We are a little bit tight on time, but we will be able to open the floor just to maybe one or two questions, Luther. I don't know if you maybe have two that you can share with us, and then we will close.
Okay, sure, no problem at all. I will just start by saying a lot of the people were agreeing with you as you were going along and reacting, but we do have a couple of questions, and I'm going to start off with the first one. Is cognitive offloading inherently bad? Haven't we offloaded arithmetic to calculators while making significant gains in statistics and engineering instead?
I think in certain fields, you know, it is going to be valuable, and in other fields, and particularly as researchers, where we are working with, you know, making this knowledge or understanding our own, it's really important that we are aware of this concept of cognitive offloading. Yes, but it is also, we need to look at it within the discipline that we are in.
Okay, sure. And I think one of the participants actually responded by saying, I think it also comes down to these two. Efficiency gained when we delegate tasks to systems versus capacity potentially lost.
Mm.
Okay, and
Thank
then
you.
another question. I see there's a hand. I'll get to that in a moment. There's another question where they ask, when evaluating a text for an author's particular bias or framework, what strategies can we use to actively check our own biases, ensuring we critique the work fairly rather than just reacting to different schools of thought?
And I think that's such an important question. And that ability to be confident in our own viewpoints and our ideas, we learn through, or we gain through this process of being an undergrad student and then moving to a postgrad student, engaging with different texts, reading widely. That's how we develop our own understanding and viewpoints, right? So we need to trust in that process, and make sure that when we are working on our research, that we are the at the end of that going to be seen as the expert in that field or in that research area. So it is really important for us to be able to feel confident enough to be able to critique another author's viewpoint, but to be able to justify why we understand it in that way or see it in that way, right? It's our ability to unpack it clearly and build our own arguments, and clearly put forward our positions, right? But it has to be justified.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Sibongiseni, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. And please just keeping the time in mind, just make sure your question is concise. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Sibongiseni, I think you're still
Yeah, I think
unmuted.
maybe that's a legacy hand. I'm not sure.
Maybe.
Okay, I think okay. I think maybe Sibongiseni is experiencing some challenges with
Yeah,
unmuting.
I think maybe some are saying maybe they are having some issues
Yes.
to unmute. Yeah. But I just wanted to say that AI it's such a huge concept, and there's so many different ways in which we can approach it. And particularly today, the views that I shared are based on the way I approach it in my work with researchers, with postgrad students, with writing-centered tutors. And even the ways in which we approach it will evolve, because AI and generative AI is such that it is evolving as well. So I think that in this process of understanding it, we really have to be open-minded. We also need to be reading a lot about it and trying to understand it within the contexts that we are working with AI, in terms of academics, as researchers, as writers.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think, Natalie, on that note, I think that's a very good note to close off the discussion, given the time. Thank you very much, Professor. Natalie, over to you.
Thank you, Luther. And again, a very big thank you to Professor Nareshni Govender for doing this presentation today in the masterclass. It was an absolute pleasure having you. And we really look forward to having you in future. Also, thank you to all the delegates that joined today. We do hope that you found a lot of value in it. And please keep a lookout on our website as well as our newsletter for upcoming events. We will be having the Winter School in June, July, where Professor Nareshni Govender will also be presenting a course there. So we do look forward forward to having you, and we look forward to keeping you updated. So again, thanks from our side. And again, very big thank you, Prof. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Have a lovely day, everyone. Bye-bye.